Welcome once again as we take a deep dive into the dark arts of the Economicon. I'm your host, the Economancer, a high priest of the Economicon. Today we're going to be discussing in the dark arts, how do we even measure corruption? So, here's the thing. In the last episode and in all the other ones we've looked at, corruption is ubiquitous. So, how do we measure it? How do we figure out if increased corruption harms or helps the economic growth and other economic indicators? For this, we need a cross-country corruption measure, right? That way we can look at between countries and within countries. So there are two major indices that are used. The first is Transparency International's Corruptions Perception Index, and the other one is the World Bank's Control of Corruption Indicator. Both are compilations of elite surveys, and those can be broken down. They have a slight amount of quantitative data and some public polling. So an expert opinion, which is a part of that elite survey, is opinions from academics, consultants, and other government and employees. These are people that know the country really well. So the other is executive surveys, which are summaries of polls for business executives. So some of the data used to compile the indices, as I said, has some quantitative aspects, but it's not much. The Control of Corruption Index focuses on a broader conception of corruption by looking at other tasks such as victimization, anti-corruption institutions, which are like election integrity, and freedom of the press. However, the Corruptions Perceptions Index from Transparency International primarily focuses on bribery, embezzlement, and political influence. Now, here are some of the common issues with these composite indexes, and the main reason why I'm making this video. First is there is not homogeneity in data sources. So different regions and countries have different data collection sources, so it's not the same across the board. And this typically ends up raising the question on what is being measured. Are we measuring grand corruption or petty corruption? Whether there is political instability from corruption or just increased bribes that is being asked from businesses. Since these are macro indices, they lack some of the necessary granularity for social stratification purposes like class, race, and the sector as to which this corruption is happening. And it doesn't give us much of the information about the volume of bribes or even the consequences of the corruption itself. So the next measurement error is that is subjective, and this poses serious problems in two forms: bias and noise. Now, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with bias, but let's kind of build an example real quick and think about this logically. So first, we're going to make some assumptions. We're going to make, let's say, the majority of the expert opinions come from moderate to left-leaning sources. So this would be the academics, people who work in the government. They tend to be more left-leaning. And then the second, instead of taking a roll call of all the business executives, it primarily focuses on the tech and internet sector. So again, there's going to be this slight bias for left-leaning. But despite the left-leaning bias, we will still have some noisy differences. And for those who are curious, noise is the amount of variance that lacks any substantive differences of the opinions, right? So they're left-leaning, you would assume that they would have the same shot, but the shot group is wider, even though it's patterned the same. So we have noise, some biased outlook on the perceptions of corruption that is further exacerbated by another set of in-group, out-group biases, and that's the experts versus the general population. This information asymmetry leads to what's called the perceptual bias, where those with the knowledge advantage deviate significantly from the disadvantaged population. And that disadvantaged population carries its own biases and noisiness. Last, the most obvious bias is that perceptions of corruption seem to be, in general, attitudes about the distrust towards the administrations of power. So, again, this goes back to that political leaning. So it is heavily biased by political leanings and your own personal moral foundations. That comes from Jonathan Haidt. So, is it even a useful metric considering these measures are used so heavily for policy, for the public service, and investment in private enterprise? Some anti corruption scholars argue no, they are biased against the global south and are used to deny investments that lead to maintaining the cultural and material hegemon. However, in my opinion, despite the problems, I think the metrics are useful as indicators of the economic impacts from corruption. I mean this narratively and econometrically. There is an obvious endogeneity problem in all of these variables, right? So if corruption causes changes in growth, but growth also causes changes in corruptions, that's the structural standpoint, or the institutional, that, corruption will impede growth, but the institution mitigates that, so on and so forth, then there is more likely some harm being done by this corruption, right? And the people being able to do their jobs, if we're pulling from this expert opinion, this wide range of experts, and they see a serious problem in corruption, then it's likely due to the fact that there is some inability to do their jobs. There's a perfect example of this. It's Sudan. It's one of the most corrupt countries on the Perception of Corruptions Index, but when using different measurements, it becomes almost the best country in the world, such as the Global Corruption Barometer, which again is done by Transparency International as a population poll. It asks ordinary citizens a set of questions about the impact of corruption, and it scores top one, top two. So, the second thing here to consider is the impact of corruption perceptions by highlighting singular cases to the point that the population thinks everything is corrupt. And this is typically done by the news and media. So they can do it by, spamming out, oh, look at this one case of corruption and blowing it up to, this wildly overproportional set, or they can just not allow as much information. And so this may end up being more of a measurement of the freedom of press and its influence, more so than the amount and size of corruption itself. However, again, we go back to this expert opinion. So if those with a knowledge advantage, they can see beyond the hype and have a better understanding of the volume and impact, their opinion is more persuasive when being paired with an economic indicator. That being said, there is a definite need for more and better detailed work on corruption in the microeconomic sphere or microanalytics. And since roughly the 1990s, there has been quite a large growth. But again, this raises the question, given the noisiness and the problems of bias and identifying corruption, are these new tools any better, or are they simply policy tools to serve an ideological or emotive bias? With that, I'll let you ponder whether you think the new tools may be better or not, giving the micro data. Thank you for taking a journey with me into the dark side of the Economicon. Have a good day.